Hi students, this is the recording for lesson 4.05 where we're going to be talking about food chains and food webs. So here's a general overview about what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to look at how we can look at how energy is transferred in an ecosystem and how that can be displayed either through a food chain or a food web. So in order to go through the concepts of a food chain and a food web, we're going to be looking at an Arctic ecosystem. So what you see here is a picture of an Arctic landscape. And so obviously this isn't during the winter, this is more during the summer months. Even though the summers are short, you could still see that the Arctic ecosystem is still able to get some green vegetation in its ecosystem. During the winter, however, we have organisms like a hare where their fur becomes white in order to camouflage it in the snow. And that's mainly so that the hare can hide or camouflage from its predators during that time. Also in the ecosystem, there are plants, right? And those plants are eaten by the hare. And there are also other insects that eat the plants as well. And so you see there are already lots of different relationships. Even if you're just looking at the hare, you're looking at how the hare eats plants and how other carnivores eat the hare. So what we'll be looking at is how we can organize all of those relationships that occur in an ecosystem. Okay, so when we talk about food webs and food chains, we do need to know a little bit about how energy flows in an ecosystem. So when we talk about an ecosystem, we use an arrow to show how energy is flowing or transferring from one organism to the next. So energy always flows from producers to primary consumers. And the reason why is because the primary consumers eat the producers. Okay, so we always have the arrow flowing from prey to predator. Okay, so this basically what we're showing here is that there is energy being transferred from the plant to the consumer, and then whoever consumes the rabbit will then be next on this chain. So when we look at a food chain, specifically for that includes this hare, we see that it first starts with sunlight, right? The sunlight fuels photosynthesis within the Arctic sedge, which is the producer. Then the hare will eat the Arctic sedge, so then we have an energy transfer towards the hare. Then we have a hawk that will eat the hare, so we have an energy transfer from the hare to the hawk. So what you see right here is actually a food chain. And the food chain is organized by putting all the organisms in order in terms of energy flow. So energy starts at the producers and flows all the way to the hawk. Each arrow in the food chain represents the energy flow from one trophic level to the next. Remember, each trophic level, these right here, are all trophic levels: producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and we also have a tertiary consumer. So again, what you see here is a food chain, and it only shows one possible pathway in an ecosystem. However, the Arctic ecosystem doesn't just have one food chain, but there are actually multiple food chains. We have many different organisms that eat the plants, many different organisms that eat the hare, and there are organisms that share that same trophic level as that hawk. A food chain is always diagram as a single chain of energy transfers. However, we know that there are multiple food chains that exist for every ecosystem. Let's go ahead and look at the different food chains that just the hair is involved in. So we see here, these are 4 different food chains that the hair is involved in. So we see here that we see the hair are the primary consumers, right? Right before it, where we see the producers, those are all the different things the hair would eat, right? It eats grass, Arctic willow, the Arctic sedge, right? So these are all producers eaten by the hair. And then all of these secondary consumers will be the predators of the hair, right? And even these are not an exhaustive list. There's probably even more predators that eat the hair in the Arctic ecosystem. And for a couple of these food chains, we see that we can even have a tertiary consumer, where we'll have a fox that eats an Arctic hare can be the prey of a wolf. So you see here, if I were to just show you this first one, like I did on the previous slide, that really doesn't give you a good picture of what the ecosystem is like. By showing you all of these food chains, you get a better idea of how the different organisms in this ecosystem interact. So this is why in most cases, when we're trying to show all the relationships within an ecosystem, we utilize a food web. And a food web basically represents many interconnected food chains. So it combines all the different food chains that exist in the ecosystem and puts it in the format of a web. And so you can see the Arctic food web right here. So you see, we don't just have one long chain, but we see a web of all these different interactions. And we see the hair at the center here. We see that if the arrow is pointing away from the hair, then that means that those are the organisms that it transfers energy to, meaning those organisms eat the hair. Whereas if we have arrows going to the hair, that means that the hair is eating those organisms and getting energy from the producers. Okay, so again, this is a much more accurate representation of all the interactions in the ecosystem. But the interactions between all the organisms isn't as clear-cut as it may seem. It doesn't necessarily always go from producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers and then tertiary consumers. Energy can actually flow through multiple pathways. One example of this would be if we included scavengers, decomposers, and parasites. Even though they themselves do not necessarily hunt down the top predators, they still eat them, especially when they're weakened or decaying. Parasites also don't actually consume the organism by killing them, but actually they just reap benefits from them while the organism is alive. So again, that's another special case. In a complex food web, energy can actually flow along complex pathways from producer to top-level consumers, which can include scavengers, decomposers, and detrivores. So we talked about how energy transfers from one trophic level to the next. So it goes from the bottom to the top of the bottom trophic level, which is the producers, to the top, which would be the tertiary consumers. So as energy moves from one trophic level to the next, the amount of energy actually decreases by 90%. And the reason why is because 90% is actually lost by heat, and that's because the organism itself uses up that energy. So once the organism uses up that 90%, only 10% is given to the consumers that's eating the organism. And so you see that even though the producers have tons of energy, it's only able to pass on 10% to its primary consumer. And then from the primary consumer to the secondary consumer, only 10% of what the primary consumer got from the producers is passed on to the secondary consumers. And lastly, the same concept with the tertiary consumers, where you see only 10% of what the secondary consumers have are passed on to the tertiary consumers. So in this lesson, what we went over are the food chains and the food webs, and we looked at how they represent the interactions in an ecosystem. So the food chain and food webs are really showing how that energy flows or moves through the ecosystem, and we can represent it by food chains, which remember has one interaction or one linear interaction between producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers, or a food web which has multiple interactions. So we can kind of say that a food web is actually multiple food chains put into one graphical representation. We also learned that the energy is actually lost at each trophic level. We have 90% lost at each trophic level, which means only 10% is passed on to the next trophic level. Here are some important vocabulary that you need to know from this lesson. We have food chain, which remember is the pathway along which food is transferred from one organism to another. Remember, it's only one linear path. We talked about trophic levels, which again, remember, is that producing or feeding level in a food chain. So some examples of this would be producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Those are all examples of different trophic levels. And then we have the food web, which are all of the interconnected food chains in an ecosystem. And this is what gives you the more accurate representation of all the interactions that exist within an ecosystem.